shh, I've got to do this. Shh, 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 shh. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming and joining us today for our third Prisons and Probation Research Hub digital seminars. I'm absolutely delighted that we've been able to join forces with the celebrations of DMU Pride here at De Montfort University, and this session has been a long time coming, and I'm absolutely delighted that I have two fantastic speakers for you today. We have our very own DMU's Kath Wilson, ex-probation officer and excellent academic, who's going to talk about her experiences of managing people within the criminal justice system. And also we have the fantastic Dr Sarah Nixon from the University of Gloucestershire, who's going to talk about her experiences and reflect on her experiences as a prisoner. And obviously the sort of lens in which we're going to be having this discussion today is under the kind of LGBTQ plus perspective. Very important issues I think need to be discussed here, and the contributions today will hopefully shed light on this perspective. What's going to happen today is Kath and then Sarah are going to talk about their work, and then we're going to have some questions, time for questions and discussion. So we'll have hopefully a lively discussion at the end, towards the end of the hour. So please do put your questions or comments in the chat function whilst you're watching. Feedback's incredibly important to us in terms of helping us to, as academics and researchers, to reflect on our own work and ideas. So we hope you really enjoy this session. I will be back to chair what I hope is a lively discussion and a thought-provoking discussion. So first of our speakers is Kath Wilson. Are you there, Kath?
Hi, Vic. Yes, I am. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, perfect. Over Brilliant. To you, Kath.
Thanks, Vic. So for LGBTQ History Month, I decided to look back at my career as a probation officer and my career here at DMU as a lecturer. And it's just a collection of thoughts and reflections, really, about how lesbians and the wider LGBTQ community were treated during this 30-year period within the realms of the criminal justice system and by criminologists. As Vic said, my background is as a probation officer. So it's a whistle-stop tour of some of these issues. And I guess the issues I'm going to cover today are the ones that have resonated with me during this period. Stereotyping of LGBTQ people is a thread that runs through the presentation. And within our prisons and probation research here at DMU, we talk a lot about emotions in criminal justice work, and I have found this to be the case. I started my career in a women's hostel 30 years ago as a support worker. I hadn't been there long when it struck me that so many of the women in the door were lesbians, I asked myself, what were the processes making this huge disproportionality happen? I was aware of issues around lesbians being transgressive, perhaps more prepared to break rules, having less to lose, certainly more likely to be homeless, unemployed, and perhaps rejected by their parents. I was also familiar with the work of Merton, later developed by Brooks, around ideas of minority stress. It's stressful being different when your goals are blocked. It's stressful being part of a minority, and that these groups might have more likely to take illegal steps to reach their goals and so end up in the criminal justice system. The residents in the hostel 30 years ago had pre-sentence reports written about them by probation officers. Some of the probation officers had adopted a don't ask, don't tell approach, where sexuality wasn't addressed in the reports. And the probation officers might rightly have believed that the women were more likely to receive a favourable outcome if their lesbianism wasn't disclosed. And certainly representation of lesbians has been an ongoing issue. But in some cases, after reading the reports, I felt that an explanation, for example, there was one woman who'd committed an arson offence at the end of a 16-year relationship. And the fact that nobody knew that the two were in a relationship, for me, hampered any mitigation or appeals for leniency that her offence might have attracted. I also guess that at this time, I had what I call my Goffman moment. I wanted to explore and research what these processes were, but I was worried about what I might find. I was young. I admit to feelings of stigma myself, and my emotions were engaged. I looked at what criminological research was available. It was minuscule and mostly in the US. Smith's work here is quite typical of what I found. He compared 100 gay prisoners in the US with their non-gay counterparts. Not surprisingly, he found the most common offence committed by gay men was postal law violations. This involved men contacting each other by post in order to meet up. What we see here, though, is Smith interpreted his results to fit with stereotypes of gay men. So, talking about things like lack of masculinity and beliefs that homosexuals were more impulsive, excitable, and less able to exercise good judgment. I moved from the hostel to university to train to become a probation officer, and my master's dissertation was about lesbians in the criminal justice system. I was still anxious about what I might find. Would it reinforce stereotypes about a group in society that were already surrounded by so many myths and stereotypes? Butch and aggressive lesbians whose behaviour might become pathologised. Again, I found minimal research. Steele, in 1990, looked at probation officers' practice when probation officers were still located within civil court work. It might seem unlikely now that probation officers used to write reports in custody cases, but the views of probation officers could have significant impact on case outcome. In Steele's work, only 2 report writers displayed any awareness of relevant research with regard to lesbian motherhood and its effects, if any, on child development. In one report, the mother's lesbianism was given prominence to the exclusion of all other issues pertinent to the child's interest. In another, details about the father's feeling about his wife's sexuality, with language such as evil and morally reprehensible, went unchallenged by the probation officer writing the report. In another case, the mother's barristers challenged the probation officer's report on the basis of bias and hearsay, as the report suggested that the child would be at risk if raised in a household with 2 lesbians, and the court supported the barrister's appeal. This period was during the AIDS crisis. LGBTQ communities were shunned and people were fearful. In 1986, James Anderton, the then Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, said AIDS sufferers were swirling around in human cesspit of their own making. And whilst many of us might remember him making that statement, we might forget that remarkably, he remained in post for a further 5 years after saying that. It just had the introduction of Section 28, which prohibited the teaching of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. And homosexuality was considered a mental illness, not declassified by the World Health Organization until 1992. To be a researcher, and indeed a practitioner, you need confidence and support. Many LGBT people had and still have issues around stress, stigmatization, and self-esteem. We do know that stigma can have a profound effect on individuals. Berzin here talks about being exposed to misinformation, and that was in 1979. And we might now talk in language about conscious and unconscious bias in the criminal justice system. And certainly if we think back to Smith's work in 1954, he used confirmation bias in his work about LGBTQ people. So around about 1991, I became a probation officer and continued to see what seemed like a disproportionate number of LGBT people on my caseload and those of other probation officers. I took the decision to share my sexuality when I thought it would be helpful. Working in a smallish town, you might bump into clients socially, and I didn't want to have to deny this aspect of my identity. And thankfully, other probation officers were largely supportive of me. But I do recall spending time talking with many service users. In one case, an isolated gay man who'd been convicted of impugning, and the police were putting pressure on him to testify against the other man. But I asked him, who would it benefit for you to do that? 2 pieces of wider research in the CJS also give a glimpse of how LGBT people were viewed and the consequences of this stereotyping. So in 1994, Burke reported or carried out research relating to how police officers viewed LGBT colleagues. And it's interesting how stereotypes can be used. For gay men, the idea of effeminacy was not welcome as police officers. On the other hand, lesbians who aren't afraid to get stuck in was acceptable. It's interesting to note that in the same year, 1994, homosexual panic was still being used as a defence strategy for murder in this country. The second piece of research there is that the 2007 retrospective review that goes on to say that the initial murder investigations were more focused on promiscuity, risk-taking, and interpreting case circumstances as sex acts gone wrong than the murders themselves. So these stereotypes are actually hampering police investigations and creating more victims. And that's perhaps not a massive shift from the Smith's work in 1954 using stereotypes. Returning to the theme of the lack of research, I think that prior to the 1970s, LGBTQ people were seen through a lens largely as criminal, mentally ill, sinners and perverts. Criminologists are accused of looking at LGBT community in terms of deviance narratives. And secondly, once sodomy laws have been repealed, criminology as a discipline virtually disengaged from discussions of sexual orientation and gender identity. Robson points to some of the basic methodological considerations. How do we do research? How do we identify LGBT people from newspaper reports or trial transcripts? What criteria do we use? And in the end, if the defendant feels they are more likely to receive a favourable outcome if they deny this aspect of their identity, then it's possible that they're going to do so. Groombridge argues that criminology as a discipline has lumped both the criminal and the homosexual together. Criminology then lost interest in this area of research and allowed the disciplines of law and medicine to take over. That said, we do more recently see some green shoots of growth in research in this area. So returning to my initial question, what are the processes at play here in terms of lesbian disproportionality? The way lesbians are portrayed, Milbankers argue, seems to have real impact upon the life experiences of lesbian women who come into contact with the criminal justice system. And I think we know from within these walls all the way to Orange is the New something. It's gone. So again, we can see clear evidence of disproportionality in the US also, where more research has taken place. Brown and Anderson figures were guesstimates, but Catherine Parr carried out research regarding women in the US who were on death row. Farr states that lesbian perpetrators have their lives reconstructed, the women being defeminized and dehumanized in order to justify a death penalty. Their lesbianism is included in a list of deviant or marginalised examples of status, which paint a picture of a discredited character. Farr asserts that whilst these women met some of the legalistic aggravating circumstances that are typically in play when a sentence of death is delivered, they didn't meet them all. This prejudice and racism impacts upon Black minority ethnic women who form a disproportionate number of lesbians on death row. So Farr argues that these reconstructed identities may serve as an additional aggravating factor in the capital sentence decision. Trial transcripts, if you look back at some of the transcripts of some of the cases of these women, they actually use words like she was a hardcore lesbian. In cases where the women dispute that lesbian identity, prosecutors have used stereotypes. The defendant dressed like a man, kept her hair cut like a man, wore men's clothing. And the one that makes me particularly curious is that they including men's shoes, or to imply, even if they cannot say, that the defendant is a lesbian. And those quotes are taken directly from trial transcripts. So one of Farr's main contentions is that a hetero-feminine image is important in engendering chivalry and therefore the possibility of a more lenient sentence. Robson argues that lesbianism seems to operate to extinguish any defence based upon being a victim of battering. She notes the lack of success of victimisation as a trial strategy for lesbians, a strategy often used successfully for heterosexuals. And again, Farr states that women of colour are disproportionately represented on death row, and intersectionality is clearly an issue here. So at this time, in around 2007, I became a lecturer at DMU, and Robson's work encouraged me to think about how LGBTQ people were viewed and the real consequences it might have in their interactions with the criminal justice system. I realise I'm kind of slow. It felt important that the dialogue was widened away from LGBTQ people solely as victims. And to cut a long story short, Charlotte and I found very little research on these issues, and yet our experience as practitioners made us think that there were numerous professionals in prison, policing, legal and probation field, numerous LGBT service users in the system, yet discussion of this research didn't reflect this. We started writing one chapter and continued to gather more information until at one meeting we had to face the fact that we needed to write a full book. But 30 years on, where do I start? Two issues I've got a brief space to address. The mounting evidence globally that young LGBT people and trans women are at a heightened risk of interacting with the police, prosecution services and being imprisoned. And again, research indicates that young Black LGBTQ people are more likely to enter the school to prison pipeline. There continues to be an overrepresentation of LGBTQ youth in juvenile detention centres in the US, at least double the numbers found in the general population. Whilst the figures vary, they're consistent in recording this overrepresentation, particularly amongst girls and gender non-conforming youths. These high rates of unjust stops of searches and arrest, incorrect profiling of sex offenders are leading to high rates of incarceration in the US. And finally, research in the UK is being undertaken to begin to identify needs of trans people in the CJS. I've only been able to touch on some matters, and there is a growing body of knowledge addressing LGBTQ issues. But Sarah from Bent Bars said last week, LGBTQ needs, particularly in relation to trans issues, are still being treated as problems and risks rather than needs. LGBT people are perceived as demanding special treatment rather than equality. And finally, my 30-year journey on a personal note has been challenging and rewarding as a probation officer and lecturer, from demonstrating challenging silence around AIDS to an anti-clause demonstration in Manchester, to pride marches, and then my pretended family relationship and lesbian motherhood. And finally, as a surprise to me, I took advantage of changes in civil law relating to marriage in 2018. It has been an emotional journey. Thanks. I hope I've not gone over my time there. Thanks.
Thank you, Kath. That was illuminating, and all that evidence from certainly from the States has made me want to ask lots of questions. So thank you so much, Kath. A lot of coverage there, and also how you've dovetailed your own personal journey into that. And I think, you know, hopefully that will trigger some really interesting questions. I know I've got some. But we'll move to Sarah. So thank you, and we'll see you shortly for the discussion. Sarah, Dr. Sarah Nixon. She's good. Are you there, Sarah? Hello.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Are you there, Sarah?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I think we're waiting for Sarah to join us. Here she is, surviving the landings and an autoethnographic account of being a gay female prison officer. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your valuable time. I'm really looking forward to this one. Thank you. Over to you.
Can you hear me okay? Yep. Brilliant. Okay, hi everybody. My name's Sarah. I'm here to talk to you today about my experiences of being a gay female in a male adult prison. It's really important that I start off this presentation with a bit of a warning. This may contain swearing. I've worked in a prison. I still talk like a prison officer at times. That obviously it allows in the role to generate shared meanings, communication with prisoners and stuff. So I am bringing some of that with me to the presentation today. So you're going to hear the expression fucking dyke quite a lot today. It's certainly something that I was called a lot in my career. So I just want to get that out of the way to start off with. So apologies in advance. Just to introduce myself, I've got a really sort of long history with Leicester. So thank you to DMU for inviting me here today. I did my PhD at the Montfort University. I lived in Leicester, and I worked at a gay nightclub called Street Life. So very, very sort of well versed with the gay scene. And then I joined the prison service in 2003. So I'm an ex-prison officer. I joined in my mid-20s. I joined and I stayed for 6 years, and I left in 2009. So some of the things I'm going to talk to you about today predate the equality legislation 2010. I got out at that time, so the experiences may have been handled differently. Certainly the grievances I put in may have come to fruition a little bit better. But anyway, that's my background. I worked at HMP Leicester, which is an adult male prison holding about 385 prisoners. There was a lot more staff when I was in post, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my relationship with both prison officers and the prisoners in terms of my sexual identity. Now, I'd say that when I was at Leicester, between those times, Leicester Prison was a good prison to work at. I don't know how that's changed, but there was a good relationship between the prisoners and the staff. And I'm going to talk to you about kind of how I survived the landings in terms of the things that happened to me and how I coped being a gay female prison officer. There was two of us at the time, myself and another female, and then we had a third one join who came under one of the Holloway 7, the cloud from HMP Holloway. So these experiences were quite essential to what I'm about to tell you, the people I worked with. I'm going to keep it light on the methodology for you today, but I'm going to just talk to you how I've made a set of stories into a sort of an analytic paper that is being considered at the moment for a journal, Women in Criminal Justice. So I'm going to talk to you about how these experiences have been framed within an academic context. Okay, why did I join the prison service? Two reasons. One of them was to make a difference, and I'm not going to lie. I joined the prison service because Bad Girls was on the TV at the time. I don't know who's on here today. I don't know whether you're my age, 43. It's Orange is the New Black, apparently, is all the rage now. But for me, it was all about Bad Girls. And obviously, being a gay female, the narrative around Helen and Nikki was certainly really exciting. Quite interesting. I'd do a 12-hour shift in the prison and then rush home to watch Bad Girls. So my life was just filled with sort of prison. What I didn't expect was the kind of labeling that was going to happen to me right from day one. I'll just give you some pictures to set the context for you guys. So that's where I work. That's HMP Leicester. If you're not from the Montfort, obviously the external on the left, an old Victorian prison. And some of the experiences I'm going to talk to you about were on the picture on the right. That was my landing 4. So not a very kind of like light, airy, cheerful place. So some of the, the confrontations I had were sort of offset by that background. I've put this picture in just to raise a few smiles, because I haven't got any pictures of me in uniform, but that was me on the left around the time I started the prison service. I was under this illusion that I was going to sort of pass it off as a straight officer. I don't know where I got that idea from, but obviously I've just put that for a bit of humour on the right. That was pretty much on day one for me. Look at that new officer fucking dyke. So my cards were marked, and I'm going to talk to you about how I negotiated my identity through my 6 years as a prison officer. Okay, why does this matter though? And I'm going to touch on my experiences, but firstly, just to set the context, one of the things that I feel there's a need for in criminology is a pracademic approach, a pracademic lens. So people like we just heard from Kath Wilson, people who've worked in the criminal justice system, bringing our experiences to the frame. So obviously my experiences as a prison officer, that places me as an insider. So I'm going to talk to you today about my lived experiences of discrimination, a bit about institutional culture and the deep-rooted homophobia that exists within the prison service. And I actually got off quite lightly, to be fair. So I'll let you be the judge of that. It raises questions around can outsiders kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of presenting discrimination within a place like the prison service. The prison officer literature does need to be updated, something I'm hoping to address myself. And I think Kath says there is a kind of dearth on literature in certainly the prison service around LGBTQ prison officers. So I've got a real set of stories here, and I needed to find a way to make this data analytic. And it didn't come without a few sort of challenges, mainly because I thought, because I've worked in the prison service, therefore my experience equaled expertise, something that Professor Rob Canton and Vic Knight have really helped me to sort of iron out this illusion that I know everything. I don't know everything at all. So I'm just here to talk to you about my experiences in a particular time, space, place and context, which was 2003 to 2009 at HMP Leicester. I've used autoethnography to explore my lived experiences. Autoethnography is a critical analysis of lived experience, reflecting upon self and the actions and reactions undergone during situated lives. I'm not going to talk too much about methodology, but that's where I'm going. I'm trying to make my experiences in some way meaningful for scrutiny in an academic context. So I'm moving beyond the realm of storytelling and aligning with existing research on discrimination, prison officer culture and prison dynamics. So that kind of sets the tone. So my starting point was a journal that I kept for those 6 years. So any interesting interaction that I had, good and bad, I'm here to talk to you about some of the negative things, but lots of positive things as well. So I went back to my data set and I tried to make sense through some kind of coding and thematic analysis. What was going on for me that I could draw upon to identify discrimination and homophobia in my interactions with both staff and prisoners. So I found personal narratives to support each themes. I used retrospective recall, doesn't come without problems. And I replayed the scenarios in my head, something I keep alive anyway with my criminology teaching as well. I talk about these experiences a lot to contextualize the learning points I'm trying to get across to the students. And I use current literature to support and challenge my experiences. So I'm really talking to you about the lived experience, how it felt for me to be in some of the situations that I'm going to identify. So some of the themes I had were sexual objectification from both staff and prisoners, in terms of making comments on my appearance, my perceived relationships, my availability, and so on and so on. I had this dual identity going on. So I kind of played it straight on the landings. I realized that at the start of my career. But over time, my identity was revealed. And I'm going to talk to you about how that came about. Sometimes it wasn't as direct as homophobia. So I've got themes of workplace incivility, stereotyping, and microaggressions, sometimes unintended and unintentional experiences like being outed in front of prisoners when staff forget that they're talking about my female partner. Then we have experiences of blatant homophobia and aggression. The paper I've written also touches on gender, so I'm going to leave that out for today. But there was perceptions of levels of competence as well, being a female. That's the female part of a female gay officer. What I found over time was, as I got to know the prisoners, again, beyond the realms of this presentation, but something about the process of becoming an officer, in that actually when you can do your job and when you've performed and proved yourself, for me, sexuality became almost irrelevant. Not always, but it didn't matter because trust and procedural legitimacy and those professional working relationships were established. So I got a relative level of acceptance over time, and actually had some prisoners defending me, never at my request, but they certainly looked out for me. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the negative experiences, but there are positives to take from that. If the prisoners like you, they decide they like you, and therefore my job and my time in the prison got a little bit easier. But these are some of the things that happened to me. So the first experience, I'm going to show you how I've made the data analytic by drawing on the experience and also trying to explain where I'm going with this. And then I'm going to run through some more examples for you. So my first experience of sexual objectification and complete humiliation, if I'm honest, and vulnerability was when I was working on prison visits. You have to take the prisoners from the main wing over to the visits room, and you have a little room at the back. There was myself and 20 prisoners, and you have to rub down search them. So you have to search they've got no drugs or weapons on them. And you're touching them in some intimate places. So starting off from the top and then working your way down. So there's me, very new, straight out of training college, and 20 prisoners. When you're kind of searching the lower half of the body, you're in a very vulnerable position. And comments like, while you're down there, love, insinuation of oral sex. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to handle myself. Certainly, we didn't learn that in training college. And they were mocking me. They were saying, "Is it true that you like women, miss? I'll turn you straight." And I'm not normally lost for words, but I don't know how to do this. So in trying to theorize this, drawing on, for example, Ben Crew's work, female staff become outlets for fantasies of sexual contact and conquest. I'm framing my experiences within a wider literature. And we can talk about Sykes' work here of deprivation of heterosexual relationships. Prisoners are involuntary, figuratively castrated. They're going through a process of involuntary celibacy. In other words, I'm getting something they're not in their perceived notions. So they've got to somehow kind of backtrack and get one over on me. So what I found was, this presentation of self, hypermasculine behavior to prove their manhood to their peers. And all it did for me was remind me how vulnerable I was. I felt intimidated. I had a little armory to protect myself from humiliation. Now, that didn't last for too long. Over time, I developed linguistic devices to challenge them. And when they said to me, "I'll turn you straight," I was like, good luck with that. How's that working out for you? But that didn't come to start with. I had to learn how to behave like that and find my feet within a very, very alien setting of the prison. So that's just one example, but I've got loads of examples to draw on. I'm just going back here, for example. There was just to show also power and kind of mocking from your own colleagues. Prisoners are not allowed to have explicit images sent in, but one prisoner had some really disgusting pictures sent in. And I came back off my lunch to the visits room, and 4 male prison officers were looking at these photos and handing them around and basically commenting on, the poses and what they'd like to do to her. And I felt really uncomfortable. And then they asked me, would I do her? And I was like, I don't really know what to say right now. And then they said to me, well, you're going to have to give the photos back to her. And I was nervous as hell. And I had to go back and have a conversation with this woman, knowing that my male colleagues were laughing at me. So these are some of the early experiences before I knew how to handle myself in a prison. It's almost like collusion. They were inviting me in to make a comment about a female being a female, but they were also mocking me in some way. So I felt really uncomfortable. And so it goes on. I've said to you already, been outed at work by colleagues. One time a prison officer had to bring me up to, I had an absence at the weekend. My cat was poorly, and in front of a group of sex offenders that I was supervising, the guy said to me, senior officer, couldn't your partner have took them to the vets? Couldn't she have taken them to the vets? And I'm like, well, you're making assumptions now on my domestic setup, and it's none of your business. So I asked him, would you talk to a male officer like that? Would you talk to a heterosexual officer like that? And he just walked off, and that was the conversation over. So these are the sort of challenges I had with colleagues. I caught 2 male prisoners having sex on nights, which was kind of something to pass the time a little bit. I went down to the tea room, and I was like, oh, you'll never guess what I've seen. And it was really funny, mainly because my senior officer was so homophobic. But actually what he said really kind of upset me, because he knew that I was gay. He knew he'd met my female partner, but his reaction was really, really homophobic. And he said to me, I hope you're going to nick them, the dirty, bent fucking bastards. So that kind of leaves me with no, sort of illusions that, colleagues are homophobic. Other experiences were, like I say, there was myself and another gay female, and a governor wanted to talk to me, but she got us confused. So she was shouting down the landing, Nikki, I want to talk to you. And I was carried on working, and she came up, tapped me on the shoulder, and she said, Nikki. And I said, Governor, I'm not Nikki. And she just said to me, oh, you're the other one. It's like the scene from The Office. And I said, the other one, what, Governor? And she realised instantly what she said. And she went, oh, my God, I'm so sorry. I was labelled on my sexuality rather than any other defining characteristic. So that's just a few examples of kind of low-level stuff, really. But I had this dual identity. So problems I had was can't be local like Leicester. I lived near to the prison, so I walked to work. I met my girlfriend at lunch, and I lived about a mile away. So I tried to play it straight on the landings, as in I thought it would be easier if I said I had a boyfriend. Oh, damned if I do, damned if I don't. They still made a beeline for me because I'm new and I'm fresh blood. But with the revolving door of sort of persistent offenders, they would go out, come back in with a new level of knowledge about my identity. I had them living on my road. I saw them walking home from work. So kind of this, this facade that I had on the landing soon became exposed. And then once I found my feet a little bit, I'm talking here about the first sort of 18 months, 2 years, I just snapped one day and I just thought, do you know what? Fuck it. Does it change the way that I open and close doors for a living? Does it change the way that I do my job as a prison officer? So I kind of started to stand my ground a little bit. But at the same time, prisoners were starting to see me beyond the uniform, and they could see me for the the quite humane approach I had most of the time. So it was a kind of two-way change in our relationships. Not to say that there wasn't prisoners who just carried on regardless. Prisoners who would just tell me about how impressive they were as a criminal. There's one guy who told me how many guns he owned, how many drugs he'd had, and basically what he'd like to do to me. And I was like, just go away, I'm not interested. And over time he got the message, but this was on a daily basis, having to negotiate and keep my wits about me. Prisoners asking me what they think of Con's girlfriends when I'm doing cell searching with them. A very private encounter. So they're inviting me into this, but they're also they're inviting me into this world. They're accepting that I'm gay, but it's a very sort of blokey conversation to have. I certainly felt a little bit uncomfortable, but I was one of the lads as well. I don't know how that sits with you guys, in terms of I was one of the lads. I played football, I went to the gym, I was just me. I was just myself. That's the best piece of advice I got on my first day. Be yourself, don't try to be anybody else. And it worked for me on the most part. And some of the officers that I got on really well with were some of the officers that the prisoners got on really well with. So that kind of, sort of, she must be all right, Miss Nixon, because she's talking to Bradders or she's talking to Blountey, officers that looked after me. So over time, I really fitted into that culture. My sexuality didn't matter. There was still the odd prisoner who made death threats at me, have you murdered, you little slut? Myself and a male officer, but it was myself that got the brunt of that aggression. So there's lots to unpick from that, and they're just a few examples of the issues that I've had around my sexuality. But over time, like I've said already, as I learned the process of becoming a prison officer, my jail craft, prisoners just want fairness and consistency. And this is a really amusing comment I've put in here. A conversation with a prisoner. Miss Nixon, I've heard the rumours that you're gay. I think you're fair and decent. It doesn't matter to me who you sleep with. And I was trying not to laugh. I was like, thank you very much for your approval. That means a lot to me. Of course, it didn't, but I was just kind of like, okay, this is all right. He was trying to be nice and trying to say that I was decent. So fairness and consistency for me was more important, and that kind of showed. So I had prisoners on my side. After a couple of years, I was more than just a fucking dyke with a set of keys. I had the right qualities. For the most part, I wasn't perfect, but I kind of won over two audiences. I presented myself as out right from the start as an officer to my colleagues, but for some reason I tried to play it down on the landings. And that just raises lots of questions about who validates me and my identity as a prison officer. Now, there was a really, really traumatic incident at HMP Wood Hill about 3-4 years ago. And a bisexual prison officer who basically got vilified, absolutely dragged through the mill for disclosing his bisexuality and left the service with PTSD. So I actually think I got off quite lightly. I certainly had prisoners looking after me, with a chivalrous attitude, very paternal in some respects. And my validation came after about 2 years where I was labelled sound as fuck. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I don't think you can learn it. I think it's down to the prisoners to welcome you in. So what I'm trying to say here is that my experiences, that yes, they were tough, but I stood up to those challenges, and they didn't define me in the end. You know, there was a lot going on in that prison, regardless of everything else. You know, I had a job to do, so I didn't. The Wood Hill incident explains, you know, how different institutions and different occupational cultures can handle something like that. So I think I'm very lucky with the jail that I worked at, and I'm still in touch with a lot of the staff now. So I hope that you've kind of got something from that. I just wanted to finish off by kind of saying, well, so what? Why do these experiences matter? Well, they matter to me, certainly, because obviously, you know, yes, it was traumatic. I was put in lots of vulnerable positions, but also, you know, my job now, I feel, is to try and, you know, pass this on to academics, fellow practitioners, students as well, becoming the researcher and the research. So autoethnography for me is a great way to do this, you know, personal experiences of my time as a prison officer to merge with theoretical insights to make the data analytic. There is a place in criminology for alternative methodologies. You know, I've done a lot of reading around this, and you know, things like autoethnography, it's different narratives, hidden narratives, the lived experience of victimization. If you want to know more about these experiences, you know, please get in touch with me, because I've really scratched the surface. But you know, the victimization on a daily level, a subtle level, you know, I had to live with that, and I had to, you know, I haven't really done it justice in terms of how vulnerable and nervous and scared I was to start with. So these experiences from somebody like myself as a academic kind of add depth, credibility, and authenticity to understanding what it feels like to be in a gay female in a male prison. And I think, you know, if people observing from the outside, those sort of narratives won't necessarily be captured in the same way. So drawing on Irene Dempsey's work, which has shaped this paper that I've written, I think, you know, sensitive and unresearchable topics can be eliminated through people like myself talking about this, not to provide an alternative, just to complement existing outside of research on prison officers. And what I'm hoping to do through this is just highlight inadequacies with equality and diversity in the prison service, and how we can best support LGBTQ staff on the back of the Wood Hill incident, which was 3 or 4 years ago, sadly, not 30, 40 years ago. So that's pretty much me. I just want to say a thank you to a few people on here, Vic, Rob, John Hockey, for helping to shape my ideas and making this paper in some way publishable and analytic, because it didn't start out that way. We all know that. Thanks very much. Thanks, Vic. That's me done.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. Folks, I'm having internet problems, Wi-Fi problems, so I'm broadcasting from my phone at the moment. So I didn't hear the beginning of your talk, Sarah, but we have chatted extensively before, and I've been lucky enough to have read your paper. It'd be great if we can get Kath back. Hi, Kath.
Hi. Vic's interface. I thought the two presentations went really well together there.
Slow here. Yeah, definitely. And I think my first question, and there's been some questions coming through, folks, so I'll put them to you as well. I'm just hoping that my Wi-Fi stuff keeps going. What do you think, and you've touched on it, Sarah, there at the end, what's the value of the academic perspective then in criminology? What more of that?
I just think it kind of just runs a little bit deeper in terms of people who've actually worked in the criminal justice sector. You know, certainly that's what I get from it. You know, we can talk about our experiences in helping the future of the criminal justice service, which is our students or whoever's on this talk today, just to understand what the lived experience is like, as well as just talking about the academic research. That's what I get from it.
it looks like Vic's frozen. So should we take this question off Anne around Sarah, whether you felt supported during that period?
What about you, Kath? What your perspective brings as a practitioner to work that you do?
It's interesting actually, because I'm actually working with Anne at the moment, who's doing some research around probation, and we've talked about the sort of positives, which there are many of, but there are also some difficulties as well, being a practitioner and trying to draw on those experiences. As a researcher, it's been invaluable for me to have a real insight into the day-to-day activities of probation officers and the way you relate to other agencies like police officers and even probation officers going into prisons. So I think that it helps give insight, but I've also read lots of really insightful pieces of research by criminologists who haven't had those experiences. But I think it's good that we've got both.
Oh, okay. So it looks like we've lost Vic. So shall I address one of those questions? Okay, a question from Anne. Did I feel supported in any way during this period? Did the POA support me? To be honest, I kept the union out of this. I think my stuff was quite low level, but like I say, I tried to have a couple of grievances more related to my gender, and they just fell on deaf ears, to be fair. I didn't go to the POA, no, but I don't think I experienced enough discrimination to feel like that. I found my place within that culture, and I found staff that accepted me for who I was. So.
Sandra, should we take the question from Rob? Thanks. Rob's asking about discussing these. That's a different one. I don't think we should be raising about professional training courses. I think the difficulty about professional training courses at the moment is that they're very short, and discussing beyond some of the basics in terms of risk assessment and general offender management, it becomes difficult to discuss all the numerous issues that we would want to cover. I think at DMU it's slightly more helpful that I've produced the book and it raises the question on a more regular basis. And obviously me making it essential reading for almost every module helps also, not really. But yeah, we do try and talk about this, and we do try to raise it, and we do try to get students to talk about service users in terms of intersectionality, but the curriculum is so full already that it is difficult.
Shall I answer, Kaylee?
We've got some more questions coming through. Sorry, folks, my eyes are falling today.
No one's. I'll pick up Kaylee's question then. How would my experiences have differed if I was in a women's prison? I've got absolutely no idea, if I'm honest. I always maintain that I would never work in a women's prison, mainly because of bad girls, I think. But just kind of, I honestly don't know. I've been asked that question so many times by students. Obviously, they would have differed. We heard a lot at the time I was in post about the bullying that was going on at HMP Holloway. So I think that kind of framed my own sort of trepidation about ever working in a women's prison. I honestly can't answer that question more than that, though. I'm sorry.
That sort of reminds me of the fact that
it'd be an interesting avenue for research, wouldn't it, Sarah?
Our timings aren't great. I was just going to say, Vic, that when I became a probation officer 30 years ago, some of my colleagues had moved from prison into probation, and actually I remember that some had moved from Holloway, and some of them were lesbian prison officers and then lesbian probation officers. And so the fact that no research has been done on that area, because we know that a lot of the staff are LGBTQ. That was one of the things that was so shocking to myself and Charlotte. And I think when we actually literally picked up a book about prison staff's home life and found that there was absolutely no reference to LGBTQ staff, we just thought, oh, we've just really got to do something about this.
I think we've just talked our way into a book here, Kath. From my experience of being a prison officer, would I say that having a dual identity is the same situation for gay male prisoners? That's a really interesting question. In my time at Leicester, there was one openly gay prisoner who I maybe should talk about because it was brilliant. His name was Martin, and but everybody calls him Shirley, even the prisoners and the prison officers, and he was really out. And that always kind of like amazed me because we'll never really know, the true extent of the prisoner's identity. That they will conceal stuff like that for obvious reasons. But this one particular prisoner, he was respected by all of the prisoners, even though he was openly gay, to the point where every time he came back into prison, he was a heroin user and always the victim of domestic violence from his partner. And other prisoners would get hold of his partner and beat him up because they were fully supportive of him, regardless of his sexual identity. So that always stuck with me, that a prisoner could be so openly gay and so openly respected, regardless. For other prisoners, I'm guessing, what goes on behind closed doors might not necessarily relate to identity. It might just be a physical act. So I didn't see too much of male, gay sexual identity in my time. Just that one prisoner stuck out for me.
I suppose I would say also that the male estate seems to be cases of intense masculinity being played out. So I imagine that as a gay male prison officer, there may well be real difficulties. Again, it's another area that some research is starting to happen, but we just don't know.
I'm going to attempt to speak now because I think we're coming to an end. I hugely apologise for my my Wi-Fi. I don't like to apportion blame, but the internet fairies are on my side today. They have been. What a fantastic session, and I think quite evident there's lots to discuss here. I think my closing question, if I may, and you can still hear me and I'm transmitting okay, what can our audience who are listening now do to support practitioners, service users with the discrimination in is what can our audience do that are sat here listening now?
I don't know.
Is that a question for us, Vic, or a question for the audience?
Yeah, for you, yeah.
I think just talk about it, just as we are today, sharing stories, sharing ideas, trying to introduce research into our teaching, and it's not all bad news. I'm involved in a research group who are researching these very ideas, involving inter-university researchers and teachers, involving HMPPS, involving some education trusts. So these research networks are beginning to grow, and there is some hope going forward, but we just do need to continue to talk about it.
I think, as Kath has said already, there is a massive need to explore LGBTQ you know, the impact on frontline staff like prison officers. So yeah, I think it's just the communication and just you know, raising the profile of that so we can start to explore. Because like Kath said, when I did my literature review for this paper, I had to take it from the police, the fire service, the emergency services. So there is not an awful lot known about LGBTQ in practitioners.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you guys for your valuable time. I'm sorry I've been so partial on this. I'm absolutely gutted, but I'm hoping, you know, the whole point of this was for you to present your, you know, your perspectives. I think we should just leave it there, because I'm worried about this being a partial broadcast because I'm speaking. Thank you everybody so much for attending. Thanks to the events team. I should be writing a stiff email to my broadband provider this evening.
Thanks, Vic.
Yeah, cheers, Vic.
Thanks for organising.
Thank you so